Just talking about how you got to Granville here, and you taught French for many years.
30 years, yeah.
30 years?
And as I said, I taught at Ohio State and Berkeley and Oklahoma also. But
where were you born?
I was born in Saarbrücken. Are you familiar with
A little bit about that.
the Saar Basin?
Okay.
Yeah. Right on the French border.
Mm-hmm.
Am I on now?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. Right on the French border, and we lived there until 1935. My father had died in an automobile accident in 33.
Mm-hmm.
So my brother, my mother and I moved to Luxembourg.
Okay.
Stayed there till 1938, and then came over to this country, and I grew up in New York.
And I think you mentioned you're Jewish.
Yes.
And so you immigrated to the United States.
Mm-hmm.
How did you find yourself in World War II?
Well, very, very easily. President Truman said I should come. In 1945, I turned 18,
Mm-hmm.
graduated from high school, the Manhattan High School of Aviation Trades, where I didn't know I was going to be teaching French. And I went into the service in June of 45, July of 45.
Mm-hmm.
And 6 weeks after I entered the service, the Japanese heard I was coming and they gave up.
As well they should have.
Yes. So they sent me to Germany.
In Germany you were assigned to what?
Well, I got to Germany around Christmas of 45 and at a place in Erlangen called the Reppeldepot, replacement depot. And they asked me, what do you want to do? Signal Corps, Medical Corps, it's all open, they're all going home, which wasn't quite true. And then he said, oh, you know some German, you're going to Nuremberg. And I protested because I had visions of myself in the courtroom translating important legalistic stuff. And I ended up as a censor of the mail going in and out of the prison.
You were assigned to what unit at Nuremberg?
The 68 50th Security Detachment. Yeah. International Military Tribunal, 68 50th Detachment. Security Detachment, yes. It's a little vague right now. Which consisted of 45 enlisted men and 99 officers. And our major function was the security of the prison. So that in the famous pictures of the courtroom with the guards, the shiny helmets standing behind the defendants, they were under the leadership of our lieutenants.
Now, who was the top dog? Was that Colonel Amon?
Andrus.
Andrus.
Yes.
Burton Andrus.
Yes, right.
Well, did you have any reason to interact with him at all?
I was a couple of offices away from him, but we never really had much to do with each other. He had a sergeant named McGee, whose major role was to polish the chrome helmet that Andrus invented and polish his drinking glass.
Yeah.
Because Colonel Andrus believed in show. A lot of dignitaries coming through, and he would take them through the prison. He also forgot to put a guard on Goring the last night, even though Goring had told him they wouldn't hang him.
Yeah. Just to stop there for a second,
Yeah.
were you at Nuremberg when the trial was over and?
I left 10 days before the executions.
Now you've heard about the theories as to how he got his.
Well, I don't think it's theory anymore. That meeting I went to in Washington, which was really a reunion of the magistrates, the legal people. I don't know how I got in there, but among others, they had the physician.
Okay.
And he made it very clear. He had the capsule in which the poison was hidden. It apparently came from the storage room of which my immediate superior was in charge, Colonel Wheelis, Jack Wheelis. And Wheelis and Goring had a very nice arrangement. I knew that because I'd see Wheelis come in with this huge watch, which he admittedly got from Goring. He took great pride in it. And apparently, his widow, Wheelis's widow, and son have admitted that, yes, Wheelis gave it to him. Apparently, he had it hidden in some skin cream.
Oh, is that right?
And at the appropriate moment, he had Wheelis get the skin cream for him, and that's where the capsule was. Before that, I'd heard theories of his hiding it in his navel or in a tooth and all sorts of things. But I think it's been established that that's what happened.
I'm going to show you a photo album, which I got, and from Charles Alexander put out. He was one of the photographers.
Oh, I think I probably have it.
Charlie, you may have it. And see if this brings back some memories here.
Now, I have the hardcover, but it looks like the same pictures. Yeah. Huh. Let's see if I get my bearings here. No, I don't have all these, but I have a book of photographs, and I think the author is Alexander. I can dig it up in a minute. These are not the same picture. There are more here. Oh, wonderful portraits of these nice people.
As you look at some of the defendants, you had reason to, well, tell me about your role as the censor. How did that work?
It was an 8 to 5 job, more or less. Once in a while, guard duty overnight, in case there was a prison break, which was totally unlikely. But basically, a 9 to 5 job where the mail would come in, and there were 3 of us. 4, actually, 4 of us. We would read the letters coming in to the defendants and some of the witnesses. And what we were to look for was contraband. Now, contraband meant packages with food items or poison or what have you. We also had to eliminate crank letters. Crank letters which came from all sorts of directions, from Germans who were angry with these people for losing the war, people who had lost family in the concentration camps, religious people who told them to pray or they would pray for them, and then odds and ends like autograph seekers from the United States, of course.
Yeah.
But mostly they were crank letters, and the defendants were not allowed to get those.
Okay.
They were to be kept in good psychological condition. They had 2 psychologists working with them. One of whom, Gilbert,
yeah.
worked next door to me.
Tell me about Gustav Gilbert.
Oh, I can't tell you much about him. I think his book is sort of, what was it, 22 Cells at Nuremberg? A little superficial. Now that I read it with a little more insight into literature. But at the time, he was a very quiet, isolated kind of guy. He didn't really associate with anyone, not enlisted men nor officers. By himself. His secretary turned out to be a very, very close friend of mine with whom I had correspondence until she died a couple of years ago. That's about all I can tell you about him.
Did you see the movie Nuremberg? Alec Baldwin's movie?
No. Judgment at Nuremberg I saw.
No, there was a movie made for television a couple of years ago. Alec Baldwin played Robert Jones.
I did hear about it, but I haven't seen it. No.
I'm just curious because Gilbert plays a particular role throughout that. Yeah.
There's another psychiatrist, Rosenthal.
Kelly was there too.
Kelly, right? Kelly. But the Rosen something. And their job was to keep these guys in good psychological spirits.
And part of that was making sure they didn't get errant mail that would upset them.
Exactly.
Were you required to read all the mail? I mean, aside from, so you got to know the contraband, but also to...
Yes, we read it. There was one older colleague there, a GI also, who was able to read the German script. Which the other 3 who were really just privates were not able to read. And I still have great difficulty deciphering that. So he read all that, but the rest we took it as it came.
Right.
and then either passed it on with a stempel. You speak German?
No, I don't.
A stamp,
Yeah.
a rubber stamp. But I love the word stempel because it just describes the whole action. And then one of us would take it down to the prison. And I made frequent trips down there, and the one I remember most was, there may be a picture in here. There was a passage, a wooden passage they built, covered passage, from the palace to the cell block where the prisoners were. And one day I was walking in that direction, and coming the other way was Goring, followed by a guard. And I stepped aside and let him pass, and that still bothers me, that I stepped aside.
Yeah.
But that was a daily trip.
And do you have any, did you see the mail from the defendants?
Yes, well, we read that too. They were allowed 1 letter and 2 postcards per week.
Per week.
Yeah. Which they used sparingly. They wrote to their families. And the gist of the talk I gave, or at least a third of it, is I wrote down some of the parts of the letters. The irony of the family feelings which come out in all the letters, from the prisoners to the families, from the families to the prisoners, fathers, husbands, most loving relationship you can imagine, and somehow these feelings are totally suspended when it comes to other things.
Right.
That's an irony. It's still hard to believe.
When you reflect back on some of these defendants and you saw some of their correspondence and from the Keitels to the Gearings,
Yeah.
do you have any specific recollection that certain defendants had certain either mannerisms or certain concerns?
Well, Keitel and Jodl stand out because they considered themselves soldiers
Right.
who were following orders. And I have an excerpt from Keitel where he states that he doesn't mind being sentenced to death, but not by hanging like a common criminal. This really hurt them. And of course, the evidence they had against him, the papers he signed, he was guilty up to his neck, and this is one of the some of the statutory law that comes out of Nuremberg.
Right.
Because I also deal very superficially with what's wrong with trials like the Nuremberg Trial. Do you have to lose a war before you can be tried?
Right.
And there's lots wrong, but my conclusion is that it had to be done, and more good came out of it, and that seems to be justified because Nuremberg has aged quite well.
Right.
I mean, the expression international military tribunal is known to everyone now. It's been 57 years.
Yeah. And what's playing out today with Milosevic
Oh yeah,
is his legacy.
I'm watching it a little bit. I haven't read all the excerpts, but he's got a case. Let's face it. I won't defend him, but he certainly has a case,
Right.
and there are reasons why we don't join the World Court. Have you had dealings with a fellow named Ben Ferencz?
I have. I met him a couple weeks ago.
Now he's a sharp one.
Yeah.
How old is he now? Well into his 80s.
Yeah, 84, 85.
But at that meeting, he was sharp. Telfer Taylor could barely speak. Drexel Sprecher wanders a little bit. I'm just a few years behind, so it's kind of...
You're doing very well.
But Ben Ferencz, he is sharp as a tack.
Ben Ferencz, Henry King, and I was there representing the Robert Jackson Center, went to Washington University where they honored Whitney Harris. They named one of the Global Institute for Legal Studies at Washington University after him. So they gathered together, and it was fun to meet them, and some of them interviewed him. Now, some of these other defendants, as you look at Goering's correspondence.
Goering is also a very interesting correspondence. He was probably the brightest of the whole bunch. But his letters to his wife, to his then 9-year-old daughter, Etta, very, very touching. Talking about spring and butterflies, and unbelievable to read those and then think of the contrast. And then after the verdicts came in, I have an excerpt where he complains about the worst mass persecution the world has ever seen, and he was referring to the Allies' persecution of these indicted people. And you feel that he believes what he's saying.
Yeah. What about Hess? Did you have reason to?
No, Hess, I went down once with an officer to have some dealings about their property. You know, they took some of their property, like this skin cream I was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And I forget what it was about, but I went into a cell. But he was not communicative. Some of the GIs would go from cell to cell and collect autographs, and on one occasion at least, he took them all and tore them up.
Really? What about Kaltenbrunner?
Kaltenbrunner, I had no direct dealings with him, but an animal.
Yeah.
Really, very reserved
Mm-hmm.
while in prison. And that's true of most of them.
Mm-hmm.
The ones who stand out, a striker, who also complains about the persecution.
Mm-hmm.
And then I have a copy of a letter from Alfred Ley,
Mm-hmm.
who of course committed suicide.
Right.
And that's an interesting letter where he talks, it's an application for a job to Henry Ford.
No kidding.
Yes, yeah. And he talks about his accomplishments at Volkswagen.
Mm-hmm.
And all I ever did was fight against the Jews. And then, of course, reading about him and the way he committed suicide, it had to be something really unusual because,
Oh, yeah.
you know, just tying something around his neck and then leaning into it.
What about Ribbentrop?
Ribbentrop, again, not very communicative, normal letters. These letters have a pattern.
Right.
They're all pretty much the same. To the wives, to the children, complete mystery as to why people are doing this to them.
No sense of remorse?
No. Well, I mean, you had Speer, of course.
Right.
But otherwise, no, not really.
Did he mention, talk about Speer, did he mention his feelings in his correspondence to his wife?
No, at least not that I saw.
Right. Were you required to report what you found in the letters to anybody?
No. No, if there was a question about should we pass this on or not, then we would ask one of the officers, wheelers usually. Sometimes there were items of clothing because the families thought they were cold.
Mm-hmm.
There were food items because they thought they were not fed well. Of course, they were warmer and better fed than the Germans on the outside.
Yeah. Now, being a German and being Jewish,
Mm-hmm.
was it hard for you to read this and to know what they've done to your race?
Oh, sure. Not just my race, my immediate family.
Yeah.
Because I lost my grandmother, my mother's two sisters, their husbands, my cousins,
Mm-hmm.
and many others.
Oh, yeah.
So that as an 18-year-old GI immigrant who lost the family, I was full of hate. I wanted them strung up.
Right.
I've evolved from there.
Mm-hmm.
But I felt pretty much as the British and the Russians did,
Right.
string them all up.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, I can see what Jackson and the trials really did, and how necessary that is, because I'm now anti-death penalty.
Yeah.
But
When did
that's
you get
it.
to a point where you kind of reconciled these two things? That you're not only the emotions, but you knew your family, what happened to them, and at the same time, kind of saying, well, there might be another side of this whole international justice.
That came much later.
Mm-hmm.
As I say, I taught French, meaning French literature,
Right.
and it came with my reading, especially of Camus,
Mm-hmm.
who deals with these things very well and eloquently. That's also a matter of age.
Mm-hmm.
But at the time, I was very bitter. Now, I never really, I was bitter against the Germans It would have been much more natural for me to teach German and French, but I wanted nothing to do with them.
Right.
And my reconciliation with the language came when I took some courses on the German Romantics and Goethe and Schiller, and came to terms with the language at least. And because of my childhood upbringing, there's a part of me that's still quite German. There's part of my cuisine which is still sort of Germanic. But as for the notion of not acceptance, but of interfering with the cycle of killing, I've come to the point where I realize that killing a killer is still killing. And I was very much opposed to executing McVeigh or anyone else for that matter. Not that I have compassion, not that I talk about forgiveness. That's not my job.
Right.
But somehow, even when you do it from a distance, indirectly, it keeps it going. So, but that took a long time, came much later in life.
Do you read about it now? Do you read about the Nuremberg experience, the Drexel Sprecker's book?
No,
any of that stuff?
no. I once in a while I'll read an article, vaguely keep up, but I almost make an effort not to read Holocaust literature. With the legal aspects, yeah, newspaper articles, but I really have no intention of becoming well versed in it from a scholarly standpoint, because it just hurts.
Right.
And when I read about the trials going on now with Milosevic and Rwanda and Bosnia, where once in a while they catch some poor Slav and convict them, and the big boys are still loose.
Right.
Yeah, I still feel a little bitterness, but somehow you've got to get started.
As you reflect back on, do you have any reason that your paths crossed with Jackson at all? Did you
No,
see him?
no,
Or,
no.
did you have any reason to go to the courthouse at all?
Well, very seldom. I had a pass, but what happened in the courtroom was mostly paper shuffling.
Right.
Once in a while there were dramatic moments, the verdicts, the defenses, the plaidoyer, the summing up.
Summations, right?
Summation, yeah. And I'd go to some of those. But day to day, I'd forgotten, but I read that it was boring, and then I remembered. That's why I didn't go.
Yeah.
And I was also an 18-year-old. I became preoccupied with the day-to-day living, my furloughs, my going out to the club, things of that sort.
What was day-to-day life like as an 18-year-old at Nuremberg?
Well, I lived on the Behrenschanzstraße, which I'm sure is on here. The main building of the Palace of Justice is on the Furterstraße, Main Street. Then there's a little jog to a smaller street called the Behrenschanzstraße. And the courtroom is actually there. And we lived in a kind of bombed out building across from that. I got there, I lived on the top floor, and there was a hole in the roof. And next door was a young sergeant from Kentucky who went to the club every night and got drunk. And then they beat up the band. And then he'd come home, and he would shoot his .45 at the ceiling. So I didn't always know he was shooting at the ceiling. So to defend myself, I crawled into my sleeping bag. And fortunately, he never aimed it my way.
Yeah.
But I was the youngster there. There were some people who ready to be repatriated, but there was a slowdown. And there were GIs.
Yeah.
Some of them had girlfriends. Then General Watson's wife came over, and they had checkups.
Really?
So every morning I had to come out into the street and be inspected. And some of these guys actually built trap doors where they hid their girlfriends. And there was a club right on the street for the enlisted men. And lots of booze and GIs talking to their girlfriends and just talking a mile a minute. They didn't speak German. The girls didn't speak English, but they communicated.
Was there technically a non-fraternization rule?
No,
No.
not at that time. And once in a while, we pulled guard duty on the street. I did that once, the most frightening war experience of my whole life, because I caught a German who had a little briefcase with a carton of cigarettes.
Mm.
And I had to arrest him. And he got on his knees, just wanted to make a little money for his family. And I think back on that, and I think if he'd run, I might have shot him.
Yeah.
That's the way we were trained. I was just as dumb a GI as any GI.
Yeah.
I think there's nothing dumber than an 18-year-old male. But we had outings. We rode the jeeps up and down the streets piled high with rubble, because Nuremberg was totally destroyed at the time.
Right.
The old city, some of it was saved by concrete, the fountain.
Mm-hmm.
The church, the Frauenkirche, was gutted.
Mm-hmm.
And there were no stores, restaurants. For that, you went to the American, the Grand Hotel, which was an officers' club. We had our own club.
You didn't have any access to the Grand Hotel, did you?
Not as an enlisted man.
Yeah.
Now, I went back to Nuremberg after the major trials.
Mm-hmm.
I went home, got my discharge, and then went back a few months later. I think it was February, March of 57, and was sent right back to the Palace of Justice and worked as a liaison between defense counsels and their clients and witnesses.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you were there for the subsequent proceedings?
Yes. And at that time, I lived at Steinkastel,
Mm-hmm.
which used to be the press center, or was the press center. And then I did have access to officers' clubs and so on.
So did you have reason to see probably the Drexel Spreckers and the Henry Kings and those guys?
Right, I probably saw them, but I didn't know who Drexel Sprecher. I remember the name. A name like that you don't forget.
Right, right.
But I didn't really know what they did, except in the vaguest way, until I went to that reunion in Washington.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I met him.
What did you think of that reunion?
I found it very interesting, but I didn't feel I belonged.
Right.
It was old home week for the legal profession.
Mm-hmm.
And I still don't know how they got my name.
You're on the list as an attorney.
Oh, I am?
No, it's Arnold Joseph, Esquire. So
I didn't know that.
No, that's a very gentlemanly term, but that's...
I think I will get some calling cards made.
That's it. But that's, I think I may have called you initially and said you were an attorney in the process of reacting to it.
No, I was an 18-year-old graduate of the Manhattan High School of Aviation Trades. And I talked like a New Yorker.
Yeah.
And nothing at the time indicated that I might someday even go to college, let alone stay there.
Yeah. I think that's super.
Esquire. Oh, I love it.
Yeah, so that's it. And you can see some of these folks, the defendants and stuff, it's really kind of...
Yeah, that's Kaltenbrunner. He's lost a little weight. A spear. These are very good photographs. Frick. Now, see, when I give my talk, I review a little bit, because I even forget what they all did. Oh, yeah, this animal. Stryker.
Was he personally, when you read his stuff or saw him, was he repulsive looking and repulsive acting?
No, he was a little old man.
Was he?
Yeah. Oh, but I saw pictures of him even as a child,
Right.
with his boots and his whip.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, I think it's Gilbert who points out that he was, in terms of intelligence, he was at the very bottom.
That's right.
But here, you can see, he looks like a little old man.
Yeah.
No, none of these people had outbursts of any kind, except Hess, and then Saukel and Funk, little Funk, yeah. And their families had nicknames for them.
Was that right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, Ribbentrop. Yeah. Yeah, I'd like to. Oh, there's Wheelis. That's my.
Oh, that's him, yeah.
That's Tex Wheelis, yes.
So he was your immediate superior.
Right. And he was in a sense, a typical Texan braggart.
Right.
Talked about how he caught the winning pass in the end zone at some university, probably Texas.
Looks like a big guy.
Tall, handsome. There's Hessen. Yeah. You mind if I just go
Oh,
through
no,
it here?
absolutely. In fact, I'm thrilled that you're looking at it because this is, if it triggers a memory or two, that's terrific.
Christmas party, yeah. Yeah, we had to play baseball with the German children because as one colonel said, we're going to teach those bastards democracy if we have to hit them over the head. And they came to play baseball. You know why?
No.
Gave them candy bars.
Ah, okay. And that was to kids what cigarettes were to the civilians.
Uh-huh.
Just,
Yes.
those are the silver hats or the white hats?
No, those are the white hats. Now, Colonel Andrews had a chrome-plated helmet. Let me go back to the Palace of Justice. Well, yes, here. I also have some pre-war pictures of the Bärenschanzstraße, where this one I've seen. I forget who he was.
And I think in the front of the book are some of the scenes of Nuremberg at the at the end of the war.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have some postcards of some of it before the war.
Mm-hmm.
Our enlisted men's club with a Nazi flag hanging. Yeah, I remember these scenes. And then I left in the spring of 48. And right after that, the new mark came in. And then apparently they rebuilt it overnight.
Mm-hmm. A photographer by the name of Ray Diderio, who was with Charles Alexander, and was one of the main photographers. He stayed around and he took photos of the city 1945-46 when he wasn't doing the trial, and then came back 25 years later and did the same location and put out a book. And he's coming to Jamestown in May.
Oh, really?
To talk about that
Yeah,
experience.
the Grand Hotel, I see, I recognize that. What's this? Oh, Mondorf, yeah. As I say, I lived in Luxembourg for 3.5 years before coming to this country, and of course I knew Mondorf, a spa. It's funny, in today's Times in the travel section, they have a piece on Luxembourg City.
Okay.
Yeah. Now let me see if I can get my bearings here. Yeah, see, here's the Furterstrasse, which leads to the little town of Fürth,
Right.
hometown of Henry Kissinger. And then, I don't remember these buildings at all, but there's a little jog in here somewhere to the Bärenschanzstraße. Here's the courtroom.
Right.
That's Backer Street. And I don't quite understand that, because we were in a building right across from the courtroom. Oh, here's the passageway. See the wooden passageway they built?
Sure. We were just talking about that.
Yeah.